Welcome to Twin City Talk. Today we are talking with Mike Comer from the Hayes Group International. Welcome.
It's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for joining us. So the Hayes Group does a lot of things, but mostly leadership coaching, or would you say that's accurate?
I would say we do three big things, and we're one of those organizations that a lot of people in Winston-Salem don't know about, but we've been here, the company, for 48 years, and we do three things primarily. We do a lot of coaching with leaders at senior levels all over the world, and then getting teams to work together to be the best they can be. And so that involves understanding personalities and styles and how do you get people to communicate with each other and work with each other. And then we also do some customized training. We're not a training firm. We started that way as a company. But I would say 60% of what we do is work with leaders around the world, primarily virtually these days. But before we used to do a lot in person, helping leaders be the best they can be.
Yeah, so I was talking, we had Graylin on just earlier, and I was talking about my time working there and how we did a lot of meetings over at Graylin, and they have a lot of cool team building there, but, I don't think companies always factor in team building, but it's just so very important,
So you and I worked together for a number of years. You did all our marketing and social media, and we did bring teams together at Graylin, but we also brought them together around the world, and you were part of that in terms of bringing all the people together in different parts of the world.
Yeah, so talk a little about, the importance of team building for companies.
So it's interesting. I mean, what we find, as you can imagine, and if anyone listening has been in any organization for any length of time, there are a lot of different personalities, a lot of different styles, and sometimes they mesh perfectly and sometimes they don't. And so it's the ability to understand how diverse styles can come together and how they can work together in a high performance. So we work with a lot of teams, not necessarily that are dysfunctional, but might be close to dysfunctional. How do you make them better? Or teams that are really good. How do you get them to the next level? And so that usually involves a variety of different things, and that is getting to talk to individuals so that each individual knows what they do best and what they bring and where their gaps might be, and then bringing them together as a team. And so typically there's about 30 of us who do this around the world, and typically we'll interview and say what's working well with the team, what could be done better, and then bring the team together and spend a day or day and a half. I flew in yesterday from spending a day and a half with a healthcare company in Nashville, Tennessee, where we said, here's what's working, here's what's not working, and by the end of the day, we're going to walk away with these 5 things, and we're going to make sure we do them. And so it's usually around behaviors as well.
Yeah,
that's probably not terribly surprising.
Yeah.
What do you find to be the most rewarding part of what you do?
I think the most rewarding is several things. One is you interact with a lot of different people on a lot of different levels, and so that's always interesting. But then also where you see people who really take to heart the process and either make positive changes or as a team they come together and they follow up. It's more than a one-time event. Yeah. And this is often driven from whoever the leader of that team is. If they take it serious, then the team takes it serious as well. One of the things that you find, and you guys know this, again, if you've lived any number of years, people really don't change that much. So you can't come in and expect suddenly, Burgess, for you to be a different personality or Tim to be someone who he's not. But how do you bring out the best in people? How do you find those strengths? And now we are all utilizing those strengths as a team. That's where it really makes a difference. So our job in the work we do is not to change people at all. People really don't change that much, but people can evolve. Yeah. And you probably wouldn't be where you are today, no matter who you are, where you are, if you hadn't evolved.
And learn to better communicate with people that are different styles than you. That's one thing I learned at Hayes Group was there's so many assessments to help you understand people better, and communicate with them.
Not to say that these things are mutually exclusive necessarily, but I would see a lot of companies involve themselves with motivation, motivational speaking, getting people excited, and it's great. You all come together and there's a lot of rah rah, and then you leave and so forth. But I always felt like that would peak and valley.
Yeah.
Whereas really good team building, get somebody to understand what their strengths are, and perhaps maybe something that they should pay attention to that needs tweaking or perhaps left out of whatever their workplace environment is, and you appreciating that has such a sustaining effect. And so I've always been fascinated by it.
Sustaining is a good word.
Yeah.
Because you can do these one-time events, and as you said, you feel good for a short time, and then it goes away. How do you sustain that? A regular cadence of follow-up, for example, and the importance of that is a key piece in terms of sustainability. That's how we create new habits, too. So if you think about it's the beginning of 2025, so everybody's saying, I want to do something different or new, is it gets started for a while, and then you have to sustain it. And that's true with working with other people or teamwork or whatever. You say, okay, it's 2025, January 1st, I'm going to go to the gym. You go for 3 days and you say, I don't see anything that's changed. But if you do the same thing every day for the next 6 months, then you will see the change. And that's true with working with people and how you get people to really work and be effective organizations.
Yeah, in the health club world, they call it week 3. You familiar with that?
I can imagine.
Week 3 of January.
Yeah.
So you don't
Which
go
is
for the
about
first
this week, isn't
right.
it?
Oh, that's right.
yes.
First 2 weeks,
Yeah.
you just avoid the gym. But week 3, you're fine because everybody who bought their gym membership is now starting to bail.
That's probably true with life in general, isn't it? With
Kinda.
so many things
Right.
as well.
Right.
Cancellation day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was saying that being part of the community of Winston-Salem, a lot of people don't know the Hayes Group. It's the name of our firm is actually Hayes Group International. A few years ago, we found out that we're spending more time outside of the United States than in the United States with companies. We've worked with companies all over the world. But in 1976, Merwin Hayes, who was a professor at Wake Forest University, started the company. And a lot of people don't know this either, but Wake Forest University was the second executive MBA in the country. The only other university that had done an executive MBA where people could come in for the weekend and take classes and work remotely was the University of Chicago. And so Wake Forest picked that model up, and Dr. Hayes became the director of that program. And so they had people flying into Greensboro and Charlotte, and maybe back then you could even come to Winston Airport for all I know, but in 1970s and before in the early 70s, coming to Wake to take these classes. And at the end they would say, we would really like for you to bring that same training to our company. And so that's how the Hayes Group got started. Started as a leadership training company out of Wake Forest University 48 years ago. And then has built from then. And in 48 years, we've worked with 1,700 companies in 28 countries, and a majority of the Fortune 500, all by word of mouth. So
That's remarkable.
We've done certainly. Suzy used to work with us with social media, so we've used social media and marketing, but not a huge complex. It's been much more getting to know people and relationship building with that.
I'm sure that when there's productivity and success, word travels quickly. So, yeah.
We find that there's a lot of people who get promoted to other positions, and as they get promoted, they usually bring us with them, which is always good. So it's a great place to be.
What's the most challenging side?
Most challenging side, typically, especially in a consulting role, would be finding the next client. And at this point, we've been around long enough because of that word of mouth that a lot of times we get calls for us versus to the trying to find the client. That would be the most challenging thing from a business perspective. And then from a personal perspective is sometimes convincing the people that they really do need to listen to the feedback that other people do, or they really do need to take these personality tests that Suzy was talking about that she was aware of to better understand themselves. Sometimes their boss will understand they need to do that, but they may not understand to do that. And so it's the challenge of not necessarily having credibility, but being heard and being willing to be heard. So
I would imagine the people who are the most averse are the people who need it the most.
it's interesting. I was just talking to my wife before I came here because I'd just gotten off the phone this morning with a company where they're transitioning. We do a lot of this transitioning of CEOs. And so maybe there's someone who's up and coming, and they'll often have them work with an outside person for 6 months to a year to get ready for that. And we often call it experience and exposure. You need to have this experience, you need to get this exposure to be able to step into that seat. And so there was an announcement that was just made on Wednesday for this new CEO. And I got a call before I came here, and he's like the old CEO, and he named like 3 things that are doing to already undermine him in that new position, including going out to try to sell the company, although he doesn't own the company. So it's one of those interesting things in terms of the dynamics of human behavior and how people interact together as well. We've been very fortunate to work with a lot of great people and a lot of great companies over the years, though.
Yeah, I think that was one thing I loved about working at Hayes Group is I have both the communications and the psychology degree, and this was one place where I kind of got to use both.
Yeah, and it worked together and do that in a setting, international setting too.
So what got you into this?
So interestingly, this is my 40th year. I started working in 1985, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had a degree in business. I'd gone to graduate school, and I went to work in Washington, D.C., and in a consulting firm, which was then accounting and consulting Arthur Andersen. It was one of the largest accounting and consulting firms at that time. And I started on the technology side, but I wasn't a very good technology person in 1985. And my boss's boss came to me one day. He was one of the partners of the firm. And he basically said, you're not a very good computer programmer. And I remember I was, I'm 22 years old. My whole heart drops. This is my boss's boss. And he's like, but we're starting this new division that's called Leadership and Change. And it's a consulting division that I think you'd be really good at. And somebody saw potential and interest that I didn't know I had. And now I've been doing it for 40 years. So that's kind of how I got started in it, with almost haphazardly in some
How did
ways.
you get connected to Merwin and into the Hayes Group?
So I met my wife during this time, and she was originally from Winston-Salem, and I was traveling a whole lot, so I could basically live anywhere. And I had moved from Washington to California, but in the Silicon Valley back in the dot-com era, and had worked in Palo Alto for a while, and then from there to Chicago. And so I met her, and she had the Winston-Salem connection, and I literally moved here 30 years ago. And then I just had some mutual friends who said, do you know, you do the same type of work that Merwin Hayes does. Have you ever heard of Merwin Hayes? And I said, I haven't. And Merwin was well established in this community through Wake Forest, but he also did a lot of like at one point Hayes did all the leadership training for Haynes, for example. A lot of work down the street at Reynolds back in the day, right? Merwin Hayes was the guy that would facilitate every year the annual board meeting at Baptist Hospital. So he was well established here. And they're like, you do the same type of work. You guys should connect. So they connected me. And Merwin's like, hey, come by and meet at my office. And that's how we started. We kind of started I was still working. I worked primarily for myself for a while after I left Andersen. And it took about a year or so until I came more full time. So that was in 25 years ago now.
So what do you love about Winston now that you've been here for quite some time?
So it's interesting. When I first got to Winston-Salem, I moved from Chicago, and the thing that I liked immediately was the weather. And so we got the 4 seasons, right? We got a little bit of snow as we got here this week. That was the second thing that I liked immediately, was not having to deal with traffic. And I remember that I turned on the local news. This was back 1995. I moved here at the end of 94. And so local news 30 years ago, lights out of sync on Robin Hood Road. That was one of the lead stories. And I'm like, this is so great, right? I mean, because we don't have to worry about the traffic. Burgess was telling me earlier that he lived in the LA area. He can relate to this whole lot more than I can in terms of the traffic piece. And then the other thing that I think that there's a lot of things about Winston-Salem that people don't know. They're a bit hidden. I said our company's not necessarily known. When I travel, people say, where are you from? I say North Carolina. And they immediately think RTP because of the work that we do. or they'll say Charlotte, and then I'll say Winston-Salem, and they're like, oh, that's where the witch trials was. And I'm like,
I hear that.
do you hear that?
frequently.
Yeah.
Do you
I'm
guys
like,
hear
no,
that?
not necessarily with that. And sometimes, again, they'll know Winston-Salem through Wake Forest University, for example, so they'll know it that way. But I think there's some hidden things that we have that we don't necessarily talk about. We were talking about, do people know that what the Hayes Group is here? The one that I found that's probably hidden that a lot of people don't know about unless you're in the arts community is the School of the Arts. And the School of Arts has been one of our clients. I've spoken at their business and arts classes and helped facilitate some of their team efforts there too as well. And I think that's a little known secret for a lot of people in terms of what School of the Arts does and how well they're known in the arts community here.
You've gotten to see a tremendous amount of growth then. I mean, for me, I have too growing up here, but you came right at the front end of when everything just started to snowball.
Yeah.
And then the early 2000s through, last month, it just continues to pick up pace. So you're getting to really see that.
Huge change, right?
Massive
think
shift.
about it. In 30 years, I was saying when I first moved here, I said, well, the weather's great, the traffic's great. Oh, there's a lot of things people don't know about. But I also said, what do you do here on the weekends? That's what I said to my wife. What do you do? Chicago, there's so many things going on the weekends. And then think about, for those of you who've been here for the last 30 years, that seems like a long time, doesn't it? The number of restaurants, the number of activities, even things 30 years ago that were some of like the chain type, fast foods and those, they weren't even here in many cases, right? And so those have come up. And then even think about downtown, how it's changed big time with
Yes,
that.
tremendously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't notice much change. I mean, given I was a teenager at the time, but from the 80s through the early 90s, it was, kind of a similar sort of feel to the city. And of course, downtown, like we talk about frequently on this, is, it was not a place you went.
Yeah.
And, then everything started in that late 90s, mid-late 90s. And yeah.
It'll really be interesting to see what happens business-wise, because at one point with the Hayes Group, there were a lot of local clients. Mervyn Hayes worked with Wachovia Bank and was part of that merger with Bank of America in the early days, and Haynes, which became Sara Lee, of course, and Reynolds and some of the others, and then and Wake Forest. But then a lot of that, our focus has been much more national and international. So there's not a lot of local clients that we look at now. When I came on board with Hayes Group 25 years ago, Mervyn, who was the founder and the CEO for a number of years, he passed away in 2017, said, oh, you can handle all the local clients because my son was less than 1 year old, and that way you don't have to travel as much. Well, I traveled every week, as you know, and I actually like the travel. I don't mind the traveling. But that's switched too in terms of some of those more staid, older companies, and now there's a newer startup mindset. And
For sure.
Yeah.
It's been very cool.
So the pandemic really changed how you guys do things, I would assume.
It really did, yeah. And it's interesting. We were able, like so many organizations, to pivot really quickly on that, and really not necessarily have a downturn in business, because by this time there was some transition away from doing a lot of in-person things. And so what people learned really quickly was how to go virtual. And we learned to go virtual. A lot of our work is one-on-one with people. So it suddenly became a virtual one-on-one meeting or small team meetings with that. So we really switched, and we switched some of the things, Suzy, when you and I worked together, we switched some of that mindset of bringing people together to a Greyland, for example, or to a Tuscany or Ireland or wherever we did, in terms of now let's do these more virtually in smaller groups. The other interesting thing that happened during COVID and during the pandemic is people's attention span became shorter. And so there's a couple research studies around this, and one is by Bloomberg Business Week that says in a typical meeting that you might be in, let's say an hour-long meeting, the attention span is about 6 minutes. That's how long you have the people. So we've learned you've got to do something much more interactive. If it's a training session or if it's a meeting, facilitation meeting every 6 minutes. But even beyond that, the attention span has gotten shorter and shorter in terms of things like emails, for example. So there's a book that came out at the end of 2023. It's now a year old by Axios, the people, called Smart Brevity, and they talk in there about the attention span, but they also talk about emails, and they say that they did a university study at the University of Pennsylvania, actually, and people knew that this was happening, where over time they were able to watch people reading emails, and only 16% of people read beyond line 6 of an email. So that means communication again. Our attention spans are shorter. We had to adjust for the pandemic. Everything went virtual that way, and then we're not even reading what we're doing with the emails as well. So it was a pivot quite a bit.
What's an email?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you would say if you were 25 years old as well, right?
Yeah.
That's,
Yeah. Very accurate.
Yeah.
Go.
My son's 20. He'll be 23 in May, and he has an email address just so he can sign up for things.
Oh, yeah.
But that's it.
It is, yeah.
Truly, yeah.
Yeah.
My daughter's 17 and 18 in March, and they do not use email.
Yeah.
I mean, unless it's school things and such like that. And to your point, it's to have a place for it to go when it's a necessity, but
Yeah.
otherwise, it's almost becoming antiquated. Which
Yeah.
is
Now, extrapolate that to a second to organizations and companies, is because now you have people who are coming into the workforce right out of school, and then you have people who are waiting longer to retire. So for the first time in a long time you've had, or maybe ever, you have like 4 generations in a workforce, in a workplace, and you're saying, how do they communicate with each other, right? So the 23-year-old and then the 63-year-old, and how do you bring them together? That's another aspect.
And I don't know why I get lost off in the weeds with these kinds of thoughts, but prior to early 2000s, that didn't exist. Each generation communicated similarly. I mean, that's just the way it was. I mean, minor adjustments. But to your point, there are now 4 generations of people who communicate wildly differently.
Absolutely.
And their work ethic is very different. And the way they approach it is different. Now, with the time that they value versus travel versus experience and that kind of stuff, very, very different. And so navigating that has been fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
I'd love to read up on that.
Yeah.
It's super curious.
You see it all the time, right? You see exactly all the time. One of the ways that we try to navigate that is, Suzy talked about some of the personality profiles, because even though you might have different ages who want different things out of work and communicate different ways, if you use some of the profiles, they basically have the same extrovert versus introvert, right? Thinking versus feeling, some of those types of things. They have some of the same types of attributes.
Yeah.
And you can use that as a commonality across generations when you're talking to
Yeah,
people.
they're still people, right? So if you,
Yeah,
if you
exactly.
get them to meet each other wherever they are, it's always a
You
win.
see that, we've done programs. I've had an opportunity to do programs from China to Japan to South America, and people say, is there differences? Absolutely, there's cultural differences, is a way to think about it. But people are still people. When you bring it back to how people work together, it's very similar and from one place to the other place.
Yeah. That's super interesting. My background's in psychology too, so
Yeah,
I didn't know yours was. Yeah. So I love that.
My wife's too.
Yeah.
Really?
I've told people who are business people, I said, even though you're in finance or you're the CFO or whatever, it's really helpful to have a psychology background, right? If you're in leadership, that's a great background to have.
I mean, almost, I would say, nearly essential if you're in the leadership position, or at least some kind of research into it, so you can understand patterns and behaviors and why somebody does or doesn't want to do what they're doing. Yeah, I think it's a skill set that, honestly, I feel like we were talking about this not that long ago. It's a skill set that I feel like should be taught at a high school level and carried forward. Super important. If we all just made a little bit of room for understanding each other, it'd be a lot easier.
If not psychology, communication especially.
Sure. Yeah.
Because what my wife and I have found out, that I have a degree in organizational communications, so HR, PR, all that stuff. And she has a bachelor's and a master's in psychology. And our track was parallel with some obvious changes, but it's problem solving or dealing, really.
Yeah.
Well, and everything revolves around communication, doesn't it? No matter what you're doing.
Communication is key.
Yeah. And where so many places where it could break down as well. One of the things I found by working with leaders it goes back to this concept we're talking about, psychology and understanding people, is I think some of the most effective leaders, I'd be interested in what you guys have seen with leaders you've interacted with, what attributes you've seen, but I think they're self-aware and self-reflective. And part of that psychology piece is it brings you a certain way of thinking to be self-aware. If you can get people to be self-aware and then step back and be self-reflective, oh, this meeting went really well. Why was that? Yeah. Because I did this and this. Oh, that did not go well with this interaction because I did this and this. I saw, Suzy, that you posted recently on social media, or maybe you'd written in some of your articles, that one of the things you learned when we worked together at the Hayes Group was the phrase we often use, think twice and speak once. I saw you post that.
I mean, that stayed with me, though.
It's like one of those self-awareness pieces, right, in terms of think twice but speak once.
Yeah.
No, it's, yeah. I had a professor in graduate school, and he said when you go out into the counseling world and you have your clients, if you can get them to communicate, if you can get them to talk to each other rationally instead of yelling at each other, getting them to communicate, you can solve 90% of their problems.
Wow.
It's having that skill. And you know it's true. If somebody will try and hear somebody else and make room for that, despite their grievances, you almost always arrive at some form of solution. So
I think that's what people miss about communication, though, is it's also listening. It's not just speaking, but you have to listen as part of that communication.
So.
Yeah, it's a real. I think it's kind of a real differentiator for people who do listen well as a leader. And I often say it's different between hearing and listening. Hearing, I can repeat back what you said, but listening, I listen with an open mind. I'm willing to have my mind change. I remember when my son was really young. He's 24 years old now. So this was back when you literally had a newspaper talking about different forms of communication, who picks up a newspaper these days. But at that point, I remember I'm reading the newspaper and he's telling me something. I could repeat back exactly what he was saying at 4 years old. But he kept saying, you're not listening, you're not listening. Why was that? I didn't have the eye contact. I didn't have the body language. I'm open to that. And so the listening is a key piece of this in terms of that communication part. I think we all know that. I think good leaders realize, hey, it comes natural to me or it doesn't come natural to me, and how do I adapt to make it work? It goes back to the old Stephen Covey model and phrase from almost 45 years ago now, and
Don't
7
say that.
Habits.
Makes you feel old.
And so 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, when he published it, seek first to understand and then be understood. I mean, it's still a good principle 45 years later. So
I teach an acting class. I have for 19 years now. And the number one principle behind being a good actor, first and foremost, is your ability to listen carefully, to be involved with the other person, not to be thinking about what you're going to say next, which, of course, is very true of life as well. But it's interesting to me. I think it's a natural habit for most people to be thinking about what they want to say and to maybe be moving forward and not necessarily engaged anyway. But I've seen that escalate, that much more so. I think the attention span thing is part of it. And watching people get centered on really listening with intent and not just to hear you, but to put it in a place where I'm understanding what you're saying, and then watching that reactivity, because as an actor, you can't skip the reactivity. It's the nuances, especially when you're in front of a camera, that make you either great or not. We either are engaged with you or not based on your reactions. And so if you're hearing but not listening, the nuances are gone.
Yeah.
To your point about body language and engaging and that kind of thing.
It's interesting. Business has been using, we've been working with some of the world's largest banks, aerospace companies. I can think of in New York, insurance on Wall Street we've been working with, who are bringing in people similar, Burgess, to your background around improv, and doing improv things with some of their executives because of that listening piece and that yes and that picking up on what they're doing and the nuance piece of it.
It's extremely effective.
And so it has been, yep. And if you have the right audience who's willing to listen and see value in it, and then you have the right person, not anyone can just come in and do this. It can be very powerful.
Yeah, it's fun too.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
That might depend on your background if you think it's fun or not. Well, thank you for joining us. How can people find out about Hayes Group?
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. So the Hayes Group is The best way would be to go to our website, the Hayes Group INTL for international, thehayesgroupinternational.com. And we've been around for 48 years, 1,700 companies in 28 countries. And if people are interested, they should look up thehayesgroupintl.com.
Thank you again for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for listening. This is Twin City Talk. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. The views and opinions portrayed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily those of the distributors and hosting companies. And if you love this podcast, that's great, but don't think about stealing it. Reach out to us and talk about the content because it is copyrighted.